You guys saw a bit of a whirlwind. You guys got a bit of a whirlwind of the analysis we did this summer. We tried to go quite wide to understand as much about this data and the phenomena that we're able to measure as possible, and to lay this foundation. So I hope we've convinced you that there's some clinically meaningful information that can be found from the social media language, that there are some psychological trends that can be forecast from social media language, and that we can actually predict some psychological meaningful events. So this is what we set out to do, and I would like to point out quite strongly that all of this is made possible by the language. I know you saw a lot of behavior over time and temporal related stuff, but remember that almost all the signals we were looking at were derived from the language. They were the results of some classifier that was written in the language. So this really was, once again, the application of language as a lens for studying mental health. And that lens is giving us a chance to look into McKeon's lethal gaps in assessment. And so we really have made a lot of progress in these 6 weeks, and there's going to be a lot more progress made over the next couple of years. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that we really are on the precipice of a revolution in this field. And I'm excited about that. So with that, I think I'm going to invite the rest of my team members to come up so that you guys can join us. Thank you for your time. When we have some people that are not here, Lyle, you have to.
I'm here.
Oh, you're pretending not to be here. But we also had a lot of support and help from people elsewhere. So this is Raina Merchant, if you ever run across her. Masood is here for a week. Meg Mitchell, she's probably a familiar face to some of you guys. This funny looking fellow, where is he? And Philip Resnick was here as well.
And possibly watching on the webcast.
Wow. Yeah, these people might be remote. We would like to leave you with this thought, that no matter what anybody else tells you, words and ideas, crazy as they might be, really can change the world. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bring it on.
Yes, questions?
Well, lots of questions. So the first question, the obvious question is, you're looking at social media postings. And at least if I go by Andy's first statistic slide, you excluded half the people because they're not active on it, and then from the others you excluded another half because they don't post often enough, and that left you at 25, and then you threw out another 5% because they didn't agree to share, so you get 20%. So of the population, this is clearly a biased sample. So based on this, what can you say about the remaining 80% of the population? Because in some sense, what I worry about is that there is a strong correlation between the subset of the population that is active on social media and one of these conditions, positively or negatively. And I don't know which direction it goes. So what does it tell us?
So I think you pointed some of the important future work that we have to. Some of the future work that we're thinking about here is what does the rest of. So let me separate your question into two different pieces. One of which is what can we say about the people that are not active on social media? Right now, I'm quite happy to kick that down the road and say I don't know. Right? There's some thinking to be done there, but that's actually not a linguistics problem or a computational linguistics problem necessarily. That's a psychology problem. We have a lot more to look at there to understand what those differences are and how they might work. So let's put that one aside. I think you bring up a really interesting point about what about all the people that are not that did not end up opted into the Somiome study or that had self-stated. How can we get at that next batch of the population that may have a mental health condition that isn't talking about it, or at least is not part of any of these studies? And so we have some ideas for how to go out and get some of these things. If in fact, none of them are perfect, but we have some, how can we go? There are things we can do. We can, from the models that we've learned, we can go out and reach out and look at people that score highly on the various models and exhibit some of these psychological characteristics, but have not stated a diagnosis, and take a look at that and see what's going on there. And so there are things that can be done like that, but there's a lot to be done there, certainly.
Yeah, and a lot of, first also note that 20% of a health systems population is not as biased as a lot of social science and medical studies end up being. But yeah, there's a lot of things you can do, and there's a whole, I mean, tradition in psychology of trying to understand how to generalize these things by looking at demographics and the common features of people that drive these differences. So I think as we get further into understanding the samples, we can control for that. The demographic differences we kind of are already controlling for, which early on in this work we're driving a lot of different. We're making it not apply to others, but yeah, there's definitely a next step to look at, and but looking across the data sets is really helpful to get towards that.
I would just add that it seems like in the Twitter self-stated sample at least, the difference is that maybe they're less conscientious, less filtered, they're censoring themselves less, that they may have a slightly worse prognosis in terms of their sort of social communicative language, how positive they are, and so on, but I think that the overall pattern is probably the same. I don't think that necessarily sort of, in a sense, censoring yourself less is better for our purposes because we're getting a picture of what may be sort of covertly going on in the people who are not posting as much on Twitter, but we're not able to measure it. So, I mean, that would be my instinct as a psychologist, but obviously it's an empirical question and it's an exciting one. I think we shouldn't necessarily kick it down the road. I think, we can run, I mean, like you said, we can run experiments today, tomorrow, looking specifically at that, comparing clinical samples with the self-stated people on Twitter.
I want to hasten the point on one thing. 20% of the population, 20% of the population suffering from a mental health condition is still a really lot of people. And so even if all we could do is look at this, at the people here that are in some ways sort of reaching out and talking about it, that's still significant.
We'll also pull back the thing we picked down the road. Molly and I, we wanted to bring the...
You guys,
We're going to kick one down the road.
come on, sounds good.
Is that a lot of what we do is, yes, this data that we're training on is biased. A lot of what we do is very generic language, and people use language. It's very difficult to communicate without some sort of language. And so I think that a lot of what we're doing is still applicable beyond social media. If someone were to say, have some other data set that they were interested in looking at. I don't think it has to be Twitter. Or Snapchat.
So I was...
should I repeat the question for the webcast? I'm sorry.
That'll help, yeah.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, yep. I was interested in the past and future-oriented language because, like sentiment classification, that was a way of getting at non-surface stuff going on in the text, and where you're able to use other annotated data to train those systems. And I wonder what other linguistic properties one might or might not be able to extract. So some things that, I mean, there are some things that come to my mind, but I'm just curious what you thought about. What would a human get, a human psychologist get, if they were trying to figure out whether somebody was a suicide risk by reading their social media feed?
Oh,
Well, that's a whole different
why
thing.
make us pass the microphone or not 3 different times?
Speak to that. You got to speak to the
Okay.
Yeah, just trying to capture the question for
Extra samples. Oh yeah, so the question, I guess number one was, Jason Eisner thought of the temporal orientation as something different from sentiment we can capture about people. What are some other things that we might expect to be represented in language we can capture about people? That's kind of part one, and then part two is maybe what would the psychologist hope to see captured by language?
Right, and you might discover stuff the psychologists don't know about, so I'm not saying you should be slaves to that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like one example I know we're looking into that's interesting from an NLP perspective is optimism, where it's how do you describe events that happen to you? Did you cause the events? If the events were bad and you caused the event, then it's considered pessimistic. If the events were good and you caused the event, it's optimistic. There's looking actually temporal orientation in the context of sentiment, really valence. Is it positive future outlook, negative future outlook? And then, yeah, we do try these, from a what we often do in NLP, which is throw in all the words, but from a psychological perspective, we call it open vocabulary, where we don't limit it and just see what pops out of the analyses as well. But mostly that's been limited to n-grams, and I know we're looking more at semantic verb-object relationships to try to understand, for example, happy people talk more about sports, but are they talking about playing sports, watching sports, getting a
There's
deeper...
that particular topic.
Yep.
I think the exciting thing about these data is really that, there are infinite theories that people are very loyal to in psychology, and you can look at, I think, literally any of them in these data to test them, like I said, to falsify them, to build on them. So, for example, the interpersonal theory of suicide is sort of a near consensus theory about, one reason that a lot of people commit suicide is they feel like they're a burden on their social networks, and they also have this thwarted sense of belonging. Our data tend to support that theory, but that's just an example of, some of these monolithic theories that, in that case, were supported, but I think more interestingly, in a lot of cases, are not going to end up being supported by these data. So, if the question is, what other things can psychologists look at and with these kinds of analyses, is just, what can't we look at?
So when you said everything's in the data, you talked about interactions with the social network. You only have the user's own posts at the moment, right? So
yeah,
it might be a little hard to figure out how they're relating to other people, but there's things like politeness forms and angry language and
even
other measures of relationship that maybe you could get.
So
even in one-sided language use, you can see quite a bit of social withdrawal. Even, for example, the suicidal people being happier at midweek and, less happy on the weekend, or using, posting less immediately before suicide attempt, or using less social language. All of that, even though it's one-sided, supports sort of these interactive behaviors that you might not necessarily think we could measure using just one person's language use. And also, in the Facebook sample, we have, is that what you were going to say? In the Facebook sample, we have comments on messages. So one thing.
we didn't look at it. We haven't looked at it yet, but we do have, we do have some interaction data. We did look at some of them.
Do you have interaction data on Twitter as well, or not from the sample?
It's slightly more complicated, but yes, we do have some, but it's a longer story. So, future work. And we had something quite particular from Rebecca Resnick, as we're hearing.
Hopefully, Philip is still watching and sharing that. I can imagine that he's saying this as well. So, yesterday, oh my gosh, last Friday, during our clinical panel, we talked about the suicide zone, which Glenn mentioned early in the talk. And as coming out of part of that discussion, Rebecca suggested looking at, we talked about sort of being very constrained, very confined in that suicide zone, which the psychologists on the panel talked about being just a few hours before an attempt. And so she had some suggestions on how to get at that type of constrained framing of a point of view, of a viewpoint, to look at maybe less change in topics. So they tend to focus more on a single topic or just a few topics rather than being more evenly distributed across. More repetition of words, less retweeting, and
One of the emergent properties we did see that the psychologists didn't expect, but in retrospect found perfectly obvious, is that they talk a lot about the status of their social network. And they're very concerned with how many followers they're gaining and losing. And this fits in with existing theories, but they didn't tell us to go looking for that one. That one sort of emerged. So this has gone really both ways.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Anything else?
I have more questions, but let me see if anybody else wants to jump in first. Okay, then I'll ask mine. So one thing that came out in Elmar's presentation yesterday as well is that when you look at text, postings, tweets, whatever, right, you're looking at a static picture of that post. How long did it take me to actually write that Facebook post, how long did I hover over the word horrible before I finally said, yes, I do want to say I'm feeling horrible. And so in other words, in an observational setting where the patient is in your room or you're in the patient's room and watching them and talking to them, this temporal aspect of their behavior, let alone the fact that speech and body language have other signals that the text doesn't have, that's missing in this. So I was wondering, how relevant that is, and maybe there's a question for Molly and people who actually meet with people or something, I don't know, or ultimately, is there a way to capture it?
So so Sanjeev's question is about sort of the temporal aspect of this. Is like Facebook posts might be like pseudo-edited, is sort of what you're aiming at. This may not be this is a static picture of someone at a point in time that may have taken 5 minutes to write.
Right.
This is clear to me that Sanjeev doesn't play on Twitter. So a lot of this, so Twitter is less edited than
I'm
that.
thinking about my Twitter, my tweets.
Come on, I'm just trying to have a dig at Sanjeev.
We're not the average people.
We're not
Your point is a good one. There is, but it is less edited. There are different levels of editing here that we are seeing.
I would just say two things. First of all, like Christy and I were talking about our tweets. I have maybe 5 tweets total, and they took me a long time to write. But the fact that I hardly have any, reflects the fact that each one took hours. Was, a masterpiece. So you can sort of see whether somebody's, more deliberative or in general finds it harder to communicate about their emotions, interact socially at all, period, just by looking at the volume of posts. And those people, like you said, aren't making it into the final sample. But secondly, maybe this was closer to what you were interested in. You do see interesting differences in emotional leakage for synchronous versus asynchronous writing. So synchronous is like real-time conversation where we're talking face-to-face and there's no time for me to censor myself, or I do it poorly, especially if I'm feeling really negative. Like when you see this with deception, where you see that people who are deceiving somebody face-to-face use more negative emotional language, but you don't see that on deceptive dating profiles, for example, because it's so edited. So I think that's a good point about that we're probably, especially for conscientious people, seeing a lot less sort of emotional leakage on Twitter than we would see in a clinical setting if you're interviewing a patient in real life. So sort of a blunted signal for the emotional words, but that doesn't carry over as much to function words. Like self-focus, for example, using I a lot indicates the sort of tunnel vision that you see before suicide with a lot of other mental disorders, where you can only focus on your own problems and it's hard to connect socially with other people because of that. People ignore function words in conversation and when they're writing, so they tend to not censor those words as much when they're lying, when they're talking about themselves and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question.
To some extent.
Too much.
No, I was also wondering whether one could look at exactly the kind of 4-hour whatever media where there's either a dialectic or some kind of interactive thing going on where the time you spend on composing a message is somehow
It's just hard to get that if you're not
Right.
Google or Facebook. I'd love to have a million voice conversations between people,
right.
not violating the IRB. You can deliver that legally. We'll look at it.
If you have a tweet, I'm just gonna say, if you have a tweet stream where you have 10 messages, just yourself,
Right.
and they're 5 minutes apart, it's a pretty good assumption that each one took 5 minutes to write. You're not writing a tweet, leaving 3 minutes writing. I mean, that's how I would.
Yeah.
That's how I would think of Twitter as sentences in a document and not necessarily separate documents in that sort of temporal.
And to put it in context, going back to this, like the exciting thing, I think what we hear from the clinicians and psychologists and MDs is not that this is a replacement for a visit where you have this really detailed, but it's that it's filling in something that is missing now, which is in between all these visits, and that's not even available. And so that win, even though it's more noisy, that win is like, I don't know, the lowest hanging fruit, I think, on it, as far as that's something they couldn't get at otherwise. And then speaking of, you're alluding to what's called projecting, which is people presenting like an altered image of themselves. I want to note that Lyle has a shout out. Lyle has a blog post on this idea, right? It's you, I think.
Yes, I do, yeah.
And just getting at it, there's really, it's a messy philosophical kind of question. If people act the way they want to be, who is the real person in the end anyway? If you're acting a certain way, that's maybe who you are.
One more super fast. So there's some research showing that people's personalities on Facebook, the way they represent themselves on Facebook in terms of, whether they portray themselves as being open-minded, closed-minded, conscientious, dutiful, outgoing, etc., that seems to represent an accurate and not self-idealized picture. That's some research by Samin Nazir at UC Davis, another UT Austin alum. So I just thought that might be relevant to your question, that people assume that Facebook is some narcissistic, idealized version of yourself, but that doesn't seem to be the case in terms of looking at, what do people think of you when they see your profile versus what does your mom say your personality is like. Those are very similar. And people do tend to like to be seen the way they see themselves, like self-verification research. Also, out of UT Austin. Okay, I'll stop.
Other questions?
So that correlation is only going to increase as we communicate with our moms on the Facebook.
That's true. Could be biased.
If everybody is out of questions, then we should thank the team once again for a nice presentation.